Today I want to go back in time to September 17th, 1787, to Philadelphia, where the Constitution of the United States, as we now know it, had just reached its final form. In Philadelphia, there had been a convention of sorts for months, for the last 4 months, where delegates from all over the former colonies had gotten together and were hammering out word for word, doing what lawyers tend to do, arguing over the minutia of the meaning of one word versus another. I mean, there's a highly romanticized view, I think, in American history textbooks about the framing of the Constitution and the signing of the Declaration of Independence and all that. But the reality was entirely different. And so you can imagine a room full of lawyers, arguing over, the meaning of the word is and all those sorts of things like that lawyers tend to do. And by September 17th, 1787, they had finally nailed it. Nobody was 100% satisfied with it. Ben Franklin famously commented on this. He said, well, it's not perfect, but it's never going to be perfect, so this is basically the best version I think we can come up with. Of course, I'm paraphrasing, but a lot of people were disappointed. There were a lot of other things that they wanted in there that they didn't get. They had to compromise, but they ended up with a document that was clear and became the guiding force behind this new nation that became known as the United States of America. Now, the Constitution itself wasn't really ratified until 1789, which is ultimately when the Bill of Rights started to be drafted. The first 10 amendments, things that supposedly guarantee Americans their free speech and their, of course, right to bear arms. That's the Second Amendment. And the interesting thing about this, my interest in the Constitution is, dates back to really my time, even before I was a military officer. Every military officer swears an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And if you've been around Solverman for any length of time, you know that I was in the military. I went to West Point. Actually, even as a cadet at West Point, somebody at the academy had the foresight long ago to say, all these young men and women are about to go and take an oath to protect and defend the Constitution. Let's make sure they at least have some basis of understanding of what this document really is. And so as part of the core curriculum at West Point, there's actually a constitutional law class. I believe that's actually still the case. It certainly was when I was there. And that was my first sort of taste of the Constitution, learning about all the different articles and the amendments and things like that. And obviously, as I have grown and have learned more about freedom and what it really means to be free, I know it sounds hokey to say that, but I mean, really it's true. I mean, it's a huge priority in my own life. And learning about that and learning about all the ways in which, the government of the United States really uses its own Constitution as toilet paper, as a punchline, it's become more and more of an interesting read. Now, just so you understand, I believe that there are a lot of really wonderful things about the Constitution. I don't have necessarily a fanatical view of the Constitution or anything like that. I'm a pretty realistic guy and understand that it was framed under compromise a couple of centuries ago, and things have changed and so on and so forth. But I don't view that as being any remote excuse for spying on your people and regulating every last element of their lives and telling them what they can and cannot put in their own bodies and how they're allowed to raise their children and educate their children, and regulating the purchasing power of their currency, and creating a code, a body of laws in which every single person in the country is guilty at any given moment in time of violating half a dozen laws or more, essentially criminalizing our mere existence because of this massive body of highly contradictory, confusing, nebulous, opaque laws. I'm not necessarily, I don't have this fanatical view of the Constitution, but I mean, this is where it's gone to is absolutely insane. There's very little basis anymore in U.S. government, for the principles espoused in the Constitution. And one of the ways that we can see that is this thing that you hear presidents say a lot. We heard George W. Bush say this all the time. We hear President Obama say this all the time, that as President of the United States, their number one responsibility, their top priority is to protect the American people. And no, it's not. It's just not. There's nothing in the job description at all that says protect the American people. It's just not in there. In fact, the president's job description is spelled out pretty clearly in Article 2 of the Constitution. And the word protect, protection, any of those things, only actually occurs one time. And the one time that the word protect shows up in Article 2 of the Constitution, in the president's job description, is when the Founding Fathers said, okay, here's the oath that we want the president to take before entering office. And the president's oath of office is very similar to those that members of the military take. Members of the military take an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. The President of the United States, this is in Article 2 of the Constitution, to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States of America. This is the only time it appears. And so, ostensibly the president's role is to protect and defend the Constitution, not the American people. And so every time they say, I have a solemn obligation to protect the American people, no, you don't. Your obligation is to ensure that the rule of law is followed, to ensure that justice exists, to ensure that the Constitution, the principles of the Constitution, the freedoms that are supposed to be granted to all the people of the United States of America are upheld. That's the solemn obligation of the President of the United States, and it's spelled out very clearly in the Constitution. So the whole point of this, maybe you're listening to this years in advance, who knows? Maybe it's some far-fetched year way off in the future, and you're wondering why we're talking about this in this particular day. It's because it's been about a week now, I guess, that some completely batshit crazy kid in South Carolina went and shot up a bunch of innocent people who were in a church. And it's one of the worst things that you can hear, one of the worst things you can think about. Senseless death and killing is just the worst. And it's gut-wrenching to think about that. I mean, you hear about it on the news and you go, oh, that's terrible. But I mean, to really think about being in that position, to just be sitting there minding your own business, and then some just hate-filled lunatic comes in and just starts opening fire on people, and just the chaos and the devastation and what that does, and the knock-on effects that has to people, to people who survived and victims' families and so forth. It's just the most horrible thing. It's really, really terrible. Just as, any senseless, needless death is a really terrible thing. Whenever the federal government of the United States goes and drops bombs by remote control on civilian hospitals and obliterates, children and so forth, that's a horrible thing. I mean, you could just imagine being in this room, minding your own business, and suddenly there's, this drone strike, this missile comes in your window and just obliterates everything. I mean, it's just absolutely horrible to think about. And this is horrible. What happened in South Carolina was horrible. It's absolutely horrible. But the logic, that always creeps in with these things, and this happens all too often. It happens so often in the United States. And, and the president was he gave this, these remarks about it, and he looked pissed. He looked really pissed, and, probably rightfully so. And he got on stage and he said, here I am again, having to deliver this message, having to look at the American people in the eye and say, another nutcase went and shot up a school or a church or whatever, all these places with just, completely and totally innocent people. It's not like he's, shooting up some, high security prison where there's a bunch of incarcerated mass murderers or anything. He's shooting up a church. He's shooting up a school. He's shooting up something where there's just a whole bunch of innocent people. And here I am again having to tell the American people about this. And that sucks. And why did this happen? Because once again, some guy who wanted to inflict harm on other people was able to get his hands on a firearm. And that, again, that paraphrasing, that's basically what he said. And then he kind of went on. He didn't really come out and say it because I think he knows you just don't. There's certain things you're not allowed to say. But going around saying like, well, it's time, we need to do something about this. And, and that's the thing. That's the call for, that's the standard token call for gun control. We gotta do something about it. It's always hard for me, by the way, to use the word guns. Anybody has any military experience out there, the drill about, clutching your firearm and another piece of anatomy, figuring out which one's the difference. But anyways, gun control is the, it's the hot button thing. And every time something like this happens, there's more and more of a call for that. And, I'm always, it always makes me kind of look and say, what is it about the land of the free that makes people go nuts and do this sort of thing? Yeah, it happens from time to time in other countries. There's this lunatic in Norway who went and shot up a bunch of kids. And you get these cases in Paris, and but it just doesn't happen with the same regularity. Even when you look at it kind of on a population proportional basis and so forth, it just doesn't happen. I mean, this sort of stuff doesn't even happen in countries that people consider to be violent and dangerous. I mean, you don't you don't hear about these sorts of things happening in Latin America and and just in different parts of the world. And yet in the United States it does. And so the reaction is to say, guy walks into a church, has a gun, kills people. Ipso facto, we need to eliminate people's access to guns. We need to control their access to guns. We need to do something. We have to do something. We have to do something to make sure that these people can't get their hands on firearms anymore. And that's a convenient thought. And it's maybe for some people it's a very nice thought to say, yes, the idea is that all the crazy people, all the criminals, all the bad people out there don't have access to weapons, and all the law-abiding citizens, and that's all fine. But it's a convenient way to think about it. But I mean, come on, we live in the real world. And in the real world, criminals never have any problems getting their hands on firearms. And where there's a will, there's a way. And crazy people who are hell-bent on inflicting damage and pain and suffering and death on innocent people are always going to be able to find a way. And I wrote about this because I saw the most horrible video the other day. And I am actually angry with myself that I watched it. But it was this 17-year-old girl who... It's the text of the video was what it was. The text of the video explained that this girl had been arranged to be married to somebody with some tribe off in a different part of the world, obviously, and had been arranged to be married. And she decided that she wanted to go and marry somebody else, and so all these people ended up, all these men in her little tribe, basically, dozens, maybe hundreds of guys. Stoned her to death. And there's this, whether or not that's even true, is kind of irrelevant. There's this horrible video, and there's this beautiful 17-year-old girl on the ground, bloody, screaming for her life, as these men stand around her, throwing stones at her, and just the most horrible screams. And then somebody finally kind of ends it and drops this, half a boulder on her face, and that's it. Those people are fucking crazy. That is absolutely crazy. They didn't have any guns. They didn't have any bullets. They didn't have any knives. They had stones. They had rocks. That's what they used to kill this girl. It was horrible. I just couldn't even imagine, and I had to. I was actually sitting there watching it. I closed the video. I didn't even get very far through it. I closed the video and I had to look up cute puppy videos. And I just sat there for an hour watching cute puppy videos, trying to get this image out of my mind. It was absolutely horrible. And those guys who did that are absolutely nuts. And that's really the lesson here, is that there are just bad people in the world. And that's it. That's the bottom line. There's nobody that's going to protect us from that. There's no bureaucracy that's going to protect us from that. There's no agency. There's no, government employee who's going to protect you from all the bad people in the world. They're just out there. Fortunately, there's not that many of them, but they're out there. And, that pesky little document that they like to ignore called the Constitution has these amendments that they made. And the first 10 of them were drafted in 1789. And the second of those amendments gives people the right to bear arms. This is something that was very, very clear. The right of the people to keep and bear arms. It's the Second Amendment of the Constitution. And in doing so, it gives people the freedom to be able to protect themselves. And this is really one of the last remaining freedoms in the United States. They've taken away everything else. Little schoolgirls that are trying to run a lemonade stand, get shut down by the local police because they don't have a permit. All these things that you and I used to do when we were kids, assuming you're somewhere in your maybe 30s, 40s, 50s, are completely illegal now. And the state comes and takes your child away from you. I sent that video out of that cop in McKinney, Texas, which is just a couple of miles away from where I grew up. And this cop wrestling this bikini-clad 14-year-old girl who's at a pool party, wrestling her down to the ground, pinning her down, shoving her face in the dirt, screaming at her. I'm sorry, that's hate. It's just another kind of hate. And there's this guy doing that. You know, and if it had been the girl's father doing that, the state would have shown up in 2 seconds, and that dude would be rotting in jail. The girl would be in Child Protective Services in custody of the state. You know, but I mean, if a cop does it, you know, they have an investigation. You know, in this case, the guy resigned. You know, I mean, this is what it's come to, and there's very little freedom left. They regulate every last element of your existence. They pummel you with all kinds of laws that you don't even know exist. You know, we published about this one a couple of weeks ago about this form. Actually, this is a great reminder. Complete non sequitur, by the way. But if you have if you happen to have a foreign company, we sent this all out to our members of Sovereign Man Confidential. If you have a foreign company, you're required by the Bureau of Economic Analysis to fill out this ridiculous form in the next week. It's due by June 30th. You have to fill out this form BE10. I encourage you to Google it, look it up. We've got a lot. We had a quick and easy guide to it in our SMC. If you're an SMC member, definitely check it out. You know, but this is one of these things. If you don't fill this out, then they reserve the right to fine you anywhere from $2,500 to $25,000 for not filling out It's a survey. It's not a tax form. It's a survey. And if you don't fill it out, they're going to fine you. They reserve the right to go through the justice system. You know, the courts. I can't even call it the justice system. It's a joke. The courts. Go through the courts to force you to fill out the form and even to throw you in jail if they want to. So you can go to jail in the land of the free for not filing a survey. A survey. And that could send you to jail. And they're going to clog the court system, you know, where there's people waiting for actual real justice. There's people waiting for actual real crimes and real restitution. And they're going to clog up the court system to force somebody or potentially send them to jail for not filling out a survey. And the sad part about it is that that's not even a law. That's just something that the Bureau of Economic Analysis just made up. They called a rule. And just simply because they published it in the Federal Register thinks that they have the right to throw people in jail for not filling out a survey. That's the state of freedom in the United States of America. And you have this like last little remaining shred of freedom, and that's the right to bear arms. And this is one of the things, again, it's a horrible, absolutely horrible thing that happened. And so they're going and they're saying, okay, you know, crazy guy goes in, shoots up a church, he has a gun, we need to ban guns. And, you know, my first reaction is, why are there so many crazy people in this country? Why are there so many people? What is it about the U.S. that makes people so crazy? There's something going on here that's clearly not right. I have a lot of theories on this that probably go beyond the scope of this podcast. But when you think about this constant grind, this lifestyle where people are just working and spend their entire life treading water, you know, sitting in a little cubicle, you know, I mean, you're like a rat in a maze. I mean, and you know, living your entire life this way and paying taxes and you know, just having it, you know, just having, you know, more and more and more of your freedom sucked away and getting it replaced with sort of mindless, baseless, you know, gladiator games, bread and circuses, entertainment, and so forth. I mean, there's some serious issues. You know, there's diet and obesity and all these sorts of things. I mean, you know, very unhealthy, sitting in traffic for 3 hours a day, all these sorts of things that just human beings aren't supposed to do. And maybe it's no surprise that, you know, there's just some people that are complete whack jobs, hate-filled whack jobs who go out and do this. And yes, they can get their hands on a gun, just like the president said. They can also get their hands on sticks and stones and knives and all kinds of stuff. But, you know, we don't need stone control. And we don't need stick control. The whole idea behind this is that people are supposed to be able to protect themselves. And the dangerous fallacy is that governments, politicians, always go back to this. They say, you know, they have this, you know, well, you know, the one civilian, you know, crazy whack job was able to get his hand on a gun. And so the sort of implied thinking there is that guns in the hands of the civilian population are a danger to society. You know, but guns in the hand of the government is okay. If guns are in the hands of the government, then they're protecting people, you know. But if it's about all these crazy civilians running around, then it's all a danger to society. And the funny thing is that's just entirely not the case. You know, when there's a police brutality incident, when some cop goes and, you know, shoots a black guy in the face, or in the back even, or some homeless guy, or just goes and, roughs these people up. When that sort of thing happens, the government closes ranks around them, and they say, well, that was just one lone guy, and he was having problems that day because he was just called out on a suicide call, and so he was deeply frustrated, and his actions don't reflect on the greater police community in general. And yeah, that's fine. That's good logic. Just because one guy does, it doesn't mean that they're all doing it. Of course, when you start, seeing this, and then the government turns around and they say, well, they're not all that bad, and so we're gonna finance these guys to go and buy, so that every police department has urban assault vehicles and even more guns and more weapons. Like there's clearly they get caught abusing their authority, and then the government turns around and gives federal tax dollars to turn police forces into paramilitary units. But the flip side of that logic doesn't work. When a lone whack job goes into a church and shoots it up because he decides that he doesn't like black people, the government turns around and says, you know what? We need some gun control. It's not like they say, well, that one guy isn't, he doesn't reflect all, law-abiding firearm owners in the country. No. They don't say that. What they say is, we need some gun control. We got to do something. We got to make it more difficult for people to get their hands on firearms. As if he couldn't have walked in there with a bow and arrow, or a knife, or a stone, or a stick, or just about anything else. I mean, anybody can go and, if you got a bottle of Clorox and an internet connection, you can pretty much wreck house on anywhere you want to go. So what are we going to do? We need some Clorox control. We need some Windex control. We need some it's like, how far can you possibly take this in the name of protecting people? Are we that weak? Are people that weak that we have to be protected? That we have to be protected by a bureaucracy? That we have to be protected by laws that make us less free? It's a sad testament. I understand people are angry, and I understand people are scared, and they're upset, and they think it's reflective on race relations and all those sorts of things. But to say, we need to make people less free. That's the only way, is to make people less free. And no, it's not. And I wanted to make this point really by pulling some data. And this is incomplete data, and so I don't want to necessarily say, this is the conclusive smoking gun, as it were. But it's kind of interesting because and you see this sort of thing a lot, and I a lot of let's say pro firearm websites and things like that. I like looking at my own data, and I always like to make sure I use very public and official data, even though I know sometimes it could be skewed and things like that. But that's okay. This is actually based on FBI data. And FBI data on the homicide rate in the United States of America goes back quite a ways. I started looking at this starting in 1950. And it's interesting in that, from 1950, through the mid-1960s, the homicide rate in the United States bounced around a little bit, but it stayed, in kind of the 4 to 5-ish range, and it started creeping up a little bit. And then there was a wave of assassinations. You started seeing, Martin Luther King and JFK and so forth, and it's a big high-profile stuff. And they said the same thing: is that we got to end this hate. We got to, protect people. We got to make sure that these whack job criminals can't get their hands on firearms. And so they passed this, this Gun Control Act of 1968. Now, 1967, before this law was passed, the full year before this law was passed, the homicide rate in the United States was 6.2 per 100,000 people. That was the year before this law was passed, in 1967. 1969, the year after, full year after it had gone into effect, that homicide rate in the United States had gone up by 17.7%. By 1974, 5 years later, it was up 58%. By 1980, almost 65%. It kept going higher and higher. And for a couple of decades, really, it stayed at this just insane level. And then, of course, the government tried to respond by just throwing everybody in jail. The incarceration rate skyrocketed in this period by the early 1980s. If you were kind of alive and with it back then, you probably remember this time of soaring crime rates and everybody's scared and all these things. And the government tries to deal with it by just throwing people in jail. And the incarceration rate went through the roof, and the land of the free turned into the Soviet gulag. Then something interesting happened, because the incarceration rate was really high, and yet violence and murder and everything was still prevalent in the country. The murder, the homicide rate was still very high. at extremely elevated levels. People in Europe said, "Man, don't go to America." I mean, I remember all those like early '80s movies. Watching Crocodile Dundee. That's not a knife. That was the way it was back then. I mean, it's just, going to New York City was like you were taking your life into your own hands back then. And something interesting happened is that late '80s, early '90s, individual states started to actually liberalize state laws. It started. Florida was actually the really big one to do it. There, said Indiana and some of these guys, smaller states early on. But Florida was the biggest one to do it in the late '80s, and it spawned this movement now. And people looked at Florida and said, "Okay, Florida's doing it," and so more and more states started doing it. And this happened really in the early '90s. We started seeing more of these. Kind of de facto shall issue licenses. Basically means that, unless you're clearly disqualified, as long as you follow the procedure to obtain a license, concealed carry permit, and so forth, that, whatever state you're living in, they have to give it to you. And so more and more people, more and more states started doing this. More and more people started signing up to become, legal owners of firearms. And so in 1994, we had a handful of states that had gone down this road. The homicide rate in the United States was 9.0. This is 9.0 per 100,000. By the way, this is a very high number. I mean, it just sounds like, well, that's nothing per 100,000 people. Actually, it's very high. You look at some of these rates in Europe. I mean, certain places of the world, it's less than 1. It's like a tiny point something 0.0000. I mean, it's so low. So you start getting into these numbers, 8, 9, 10, 12. I mean, these are big numbers. Particularly for supposedly an advanced, civilized, free country. So 9.0 in 1994. Then 1995 was this bonanza year where Arkansas, Nevada, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Texas, Utah, and Virginia all passed these laws. In 1996, you had a couple more states, Kentucky, Louisiana, and South Carolina. So we had, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 states basically in 2 years, 1995 and 1996. So the last full year before that happened, the homicide rate 9.0. By 1997, the first full year after those 10 states had taken over, homicide rate falls to 6.8. It's 24.4% decrease. And it's interesting because as the more and more states began to liberalize their laws and sort of start these, shall issue licenses and become more liberalized about their concealed carry and how they're going to issue firearms, and you get, states like, Arizona and so forth that say, hey, you're in Arizona, you just carry. The more that happened, the more the homicide rate actually started to fall. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of other factors involved, but there's a very strong positive correlation. I guess actually it would be this negative correlation between the number of states that pass these laws, liberalizing their laws, and the murder rate. The more states started doing this, the murder rate goes down. Interestingly enough, when the United States government passed this gun control law, the homicide rate soared. So that's some very clear and objective evidence. I mean, this is the FBI's own number. This isn't some gun lobby or anything like that. This is the FBI's own crime statistics, and just pulling out the major, gun control legislation and state legislation over the past couple of decades. So it's pretty clear there's a relationship, in that the more, you have to, I think, at least acknowledge the data shows that there is some influence. Maybe it's some wild coincidence that as more and more states start liberalizing their gun control laws, and more Americans go out and become legal, law-abiding owners of firearms. Maybe it's some wild coincidence that the murder rate starts to fall dramatically. Maybe it's just a complete and total coincidence, but I don't think so. I have to imagine it has some sort of influence. But the bigger picture really is this. This is one of the last remaining freedoms in the United States, and there's some very loud and strong calls to take it away. And it goes back to what one of the founding fathers, Ben Franklin, would say, which is often paraphrased as, those who would sacrifice liberty for security deserve neither liberty nor security. Franklin was actually much well, I might have to do a whole other podcast on that one time, because it's a great quote and a great letter. It goes long above and beyond that one particular quote, but it's true. The meaning is certainly true. And right now, people are scared. They're angry. I mean, people are extremely angry, and there are very loud calls to want to be protected. That the government needs to do something. People need to be protected. I would respectfully submit that putting yourself in the hands of an institution that has an almost uninterrupted track record of abusing its authority, using violence and intimidation as tactics, and to outsource your security to this institution and giving them exclusive and total control over your personal security, your personal safety, your protection, your family's protection, is probably not a good idea. The one last remaining freedom that you really have is this right to bear arms, and they want to take it away. They want to control it. They want to curtail it. Maybe they don't want to get rid of it. That's probably a little sensationalist. It would be incorrect to say they want to, eliminate, firearms and so forth. And I'm sure in their view, they want to do things that they view as sensible. They think that they think it's for a just cause. They think it's all well intended. And sure, that's nice. What a nice intention, to say, oh, we just want to protect people. Yeah, that's very nice. It's a nice thing to say. I want to protect people. Sure, that's great. But oftentimes the road to ruin is really paved in good intentions, particularly when those intentions lead to not having freedom that you once had. And when you're talking about outsourcing your security to this organization, this institution that has an uninterrupted track record of violence, abuse, and intimidation, it sucks having to live in a world where there are crazy people, where there's guys like this kid. I won't even say his name. He doesn't deserve it. Doesn't deserve to be famous. People who are absolutely batshit crazy, and it sucks having to live in that world. But it would be far more unfortunate to give up one of your last remaining freedoms simply because people are scared and angry and feel like they have to do something, and giving up that freedom to an institution that has an uninterrupted track record of violence and intimidation. That would be an even worse world to live in. And I certainly hope it doesn't go down that road. So thank you very much for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.